from the Holocaust to resistance. Generally, I have to tell you that it's not about the Holocaust, really. It's about resistance. It's about how my life intersects with history, past and future. For me, history is all about ordinary people, their lives, their dreams, and efforts to achieve freedom and collective well-being. Each of us has a personal view of history based on background, experience, and hopes for the future. This world outlook helps shape our personality. And even if we say we don't care, a great man once said, "You may not be concerned with history, but history is concerned about you." In my case, my background is the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews of Europe. That shaped my view of history. So that's where I'll begin. Excuse my cold. Let me tell you how I was rescued from fascist killers in France, where I was born 79 years ago. Back in 1942. Nazi dictator Hitler, Adolf Hitler, marked me down for death. I was in Paris, only 1 year old. Why did Hitler want to kill me? Only 1 year old. Because he was a racist. He believed that humanity consists of mutually hostile races. The best are on top, the whites. He called them Aryans. And on the bottom are what he called subhuman. Africans, Asians, Slavs, Gypsies, Jews. I'm Jewish. True, I appear white. But for the real racists, skin color is not the whole story. The most vital issue is blood. If I lived, I could give birth to more subhumans. It sounds hard to believe, but Hitler's attempts to clear out the so-called subhumans cost the lives of tens of millions. And even today, there are still many white wing extremists who peddle the racist poison of white supremacy. During the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, Nazi rulers of Germany seized land and wealth and resources all across Europe. They said Germany needed Lebensraum, living space. They had a vast colonization project, waging war to kill and replace the residents of those lands. To replace the residents of those lands that they conquered. The Nazis of Germany found allies in new government in France, the city of Vichy. and the Vichy government, headed by right-wing general Philippe Pétain, who helped to carry out Hitler's orders. It was actually the French police who arrested my mother and gave her to Hitler to be killed. The French authorities campaigned against immigrants and refugees who were blamed for unemployment. The government tried to get rid of immigrants, including my parents, who had fled persecution in Poland and Ukraine. Hitler offered to help. French police arrested the Jews as undesirables and handed them over to the Nazis to be shipped to Auschwitz. There they were to be killed. Tens of thousands were locked up in concentration camps and then sent to be killed. How was it that I survived? A great many people helped to protect me. Some policemen leaked word of a huge anti-Jewish roundup in Paris. Members of the Jewish resistance organizations went door to door to spread the alarm. At that moment, my mother left her home and took me along and escaped. That particular roundup in Paris led the Jewish population to realize that their children had to be hidden. They adopted the slogan, "Save the children," by dispersing them. Families began searching for sanctuaries. False papers were prepared. Transport arrangements were made, all in an atmosphere of urgency and despair. The Jewish resistance helped my mother place me in the care of a non-Jewish nanny. This was an illegal action. A year later, my mother was killed in Auschwitz. The Jewish resistance decided to hide me in an agricultural area in Auvergne, in the south of France. A woman of the resistance posed as my mother and took me south by train. A French cop on the train approved of her fake identity papers without examining them carefully. French resistance workers in the city of Lyon arranged for me to be sent to a remote village. The village mayor assigned me to a family, and the family welcomed me with love. I lived and played in plain sight of the villagers, who were happy to receive me as a new addition to their community. Just think. I explained to you. I went through about each person who helped me. Some of them, each person. Just think of how many individuals contributed to my survival. Tens of thousands of children were saved in a similar way. How is this possible? I asked René Raoul, who was then 92 years old. 7 decades earlier, under Nazi occupation, he had coordinated the hiding of almost 150 Jews in his town of Malzieu. I asked him, how many of the Jews in Malzieu were denounced to the authorities? He said, none. So did everyone in Malzieu want the Jews to be there? Not at all, he replied. Some were anti-Jewish. Why didn't they denounce the Jews, I asked. He said, they may have had resentful thoughts, but they didn't act on them. They would not act against the feelings of their community. So even some Jew haters helped in saving the Jews. Renee's courageous achievement was made possible by the moral support of his entire community, even those who disagreed. I did nothing special, he said. It was the only human thing to do. This was the anti-Nazi resistance in action. It included armed combatants, civilian activists who helped through spontaneous acts of kindness, and those who helped failing to carry out evil orders. A great many resistors who fought against the Nazis were immigrants, Spanish, North Africans, Jewish, Italian, Soviet Muslims, and others. As social and labor activists, we have a word for this human impulse to care for one another, to express our love through action. It's called solidarity. In this way, a multitude of small individual acts of courage and kindness are forged in a chain of solidarity across the country, which helped defeat the Nazis and change the face of France for the better. How did I recover from fascism? Both my parents died in the war. As a child, I lived in orphanages run by former resistance activists. They taught us about solidarity and about working for a world of peace and love. I adopted these principles as the guiding star of my life. And I have devoted my years to social justice and political activism. Now I will tell you about how I applied the lessons of my survivals in about 6 points. First, my first struggle with injustice took place in New York in my family, my adoptive family, that had adopted me at the age 9. For my first year with my adopted parents, my father insisted on his narrow view of women. Their role, he said, was determined by biology, he said. They were destined to find a mate, marry, take care of a husband and a household, and bear children. I rejected this agenda. This led to such ferocious, fierce, and frightening disputes with my father that I fled my home at the age of 17. and took refuge with a girlfriend, Jean. It was then an illegal act for minors. It was illegal for minors to leave their home without permission. And so my adopted parents hauled me into court. They launched a legal fight against Jean's parents, accusing the mother of influencing me to be a lesbian. What were lesbians? Everyone seemed to hate them. And so the courts were partial to my parents. I spent my junior year behind bars in a detention house. I made friends with the other inmates, mostly young Puerto Rican women who had fled their homes because they had been sexually abused by men. The courts jailed the victims. There was no justice for them. As for lesbianism, I thought that a same-sex orientation is part of nature. But it was more than a decade before gays and lesbians were able to establish themselves as a visible movement. And then things changed very fast. My outlook, so unpopular in my youth, was eventually accepted by nearly everybody. When I got out of detention and went back to school, the big issue was African American human rights. I had learned about the mistreatment of black people when I arrived in the United States in 1950. The South was held down by racist laws, and they were called Jim Crow laws. And in the North, they suffered discrimination. Black people built a massive movement for their human rights, and many whites joined in their actions for equal rights and equal opportunity. Activists faced police attack dogs, beatings, and arbitrary arrests. Up to 1968, more than 40 were murdered, and still the killings continued. All this had a great impact on me. In my high school, the debate was whether blacks should have their equal rights and opportunity now or later. Blacks called for freedom now. Why should we wait, they said. Our ancestors were slaves in the U.S. almost since the arrival of Europeans 300 years ago. That's long enough. I agreed. I learned about 2 black boys who were less than 10 years old who were sentenced to indefinite detention because one of them had been kissed by a little white girl. Kissed on the cheek, and they were 7 and 10 years old. They didn't know about hatred and prejudice. It was called the kissing case. The sentences to these little black boys aroused great public indignation. But legal appeals in the U.S. courts were unheeded. It was only an international protest that finally won those little boys their release 4 months later. But of course with no apology. But it was a shame. It was shame on the United States, who claimed to be democratic. I lived in Los Angeles at the time and took part in the boycott and picketing of a national chain called Woolworth, where Afro-Americans were excluded from the lunch counters. Imagine today the dollar stores having a snack bar. We won, that's what Woolworth was like. We won the battle, but there were other issues, like the voting rights for black people. The movement won a Supreme Court ruling to desegregate the schools, the public schools. But state governments refused to comply. African Americans and their supporters, like me, engaged in mass nonviolent protests in the South and across the country. I thought that talking freedom was essential. We had many discussions, but acting was critical. I joined the protests. I helped circulate the writings of the great black leader, Malcolm X. I worked in newly integrated factories where I linked up with the Afro-American workers and unionists. I helped defend Gary Tyler, a black teenager framed up for murder in Louisiana in 1974. He was released from prison in 2016. He was innocent. African Americans won major gains, but racists haven't given up. Back in 1959, I became a socialist, convinced we had to change the whole system of capitalism under which we live. As I saw it, capitalism puts profit over the needs of humankind and uses racism to divide people. Socialism aims at putting humankind over profits and for a democratic society where all people enjoy kindness, love, and equal opportunity. This expresses the deep impulses we all feel to love and care for each other. The idea of socialism was then supported by only a small minority in this country. But there was one issue in which the socialists and their allies won majority support: the need for the U.S. armed forces to withdraw from the war in Vietnam. I wonder how many of you heard about the war in Vietnam. That's good. More should have. Early in my youth, I sympathized with the peace movement, which called for the abolition of nuclear weapons, where there was widespread fear of a new world war, fought with nuclear weapons which would destroy humanity. In Vietnam, there was a popular insurrection to unify their country and win independence from the U.S. and other countries who were trying to lay their government on them. The U.S. government tried to save its Vietnam puppets regime, first with weapons and advisors, and then with the Air Force and hundreds of thousands of combat troops. Peace activists like myself demonstrated against this war. Our demand was out now. Withdraw the U.S. troops now. And that's how the war ended. It took 10 years of anguish for the Vietnamese and for the people of the United States. 60,000 U.S. soldiers killed and more than 1 million Vietnamese. We who opposed the war started as a tiny minority, and yet we grew to be the immense majority. I was involved in a wing of the movement that forged an alliance with the active duty soldiers. They were mostly conscripts, not volunteers. At first, some anti-war protesters insulted the soldiers and called them fascists and killers. But the soldiers turned out to be allies. Some of them courageously marched in demonstrations. Then they were disciplined by the government. But the soldiers defended their First Amendment rights to express their views, and they won. This country lost a major war due in part to an uprising of its own citizens against its government war policies. Society changed for the better. Among the gains were that we ended military conscription, and for several decades the government found it difficult to convince people that the U.S. should fight in other wars. Unfortunately, in the new century, the U.S. has fought new aggressive wars while intervening in the affairs of weaker countries, whether in Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Bolivia. The Jewish people was doing. They had a policy of ethnic cleansing. They had a policy of colonization. He didn't like that, so he left, and he went to France, and that's where he met my mother. The proud indigenous Palestinian people with their rich and ancient culture were forced into exile at the point of a gun. This was done in the name of finding a home for the Jews who had survived the Holocaust. Very true. After the war, Jews tried to go home, to Poland, for instance. It was hard to get back. The Polish people threatened to kill them. So they looked for some place to go, and they decided on Palestine. It's a whole big story which you should become familiar with. But at the same time, however, they took the land from the Palestinian people, and they did not allow them to return. And they refused to give them equal rights in Israel. And they occupy the Palestinian people. There's a very big prison in Palestine, Israel. It's called Gaza. And you can learn more about that. I, as a Jew and a Holocaust survivor, am opposed to the policies of the Israeli government. I am not the only one. They do not represent the Jewish people. The Jewish people are all over the world. All over the world. They don't consider Israel as representing them. As I matured, I decided to enter the industrial job market because they offered equal opportunity for wages and benefits for women. Women could earn the same as men if the job was unionized. My first job in industry was a ship scaler. It was a hard job. Railroads, chemical plants, oil refineries, and other industrial jobs. I trailblazed for women so that women could establish themselves in these industries. It was a constant effort to convince women and men that we as women had the right to earn an equal living. This was particularly important because the majority of children living with sole support was with their mother. And these families lived under the poverty level. On the job, we women faced constant jibes that we should not be taking such jobs, and we should stick to our cooking and our knitting, and sexist put-downs and obscene jokes and also black workers were denied opportunities for advancement. Nonetheless, women hung in there, and over the years, women became established in new areas of employment, and not just in industry, but in every other kind of job. Lawyers, doctors, professors, and governmental agencies. Today, as women's rights advocates, we women ran into strong resistance, but over the decades, we've made some progress. However, we know that on sexual assault, we need much further to go. So today, immigrants and refugees here in other countries are under attack. Many face harassment, detention, expulsion. Today, we face global climate change. It's been caused largely because of the free market, the profit system. Canada and the United States continue to burn more coal and petroleum, which speeds the global climate disaster. The victims of climate crisis are mostly people of color in the global South who lose their home and livelihood. The racists have an answer. They say it's not our problem. They say, build walls, keep them out. A couple of months ago, thousands of Bahamians were driven from their homes by climate disaster. It was called Hurricane Dorian. The US president said, Bahamians are very bad people. They're gang members. They're drug dealers. Keep them out. What we see here is the onset of climate barbarism, the connecting of white supremacy, violence, with vicious anti-immigrant racism. If racism and climate barbarism triumph, they will infect and poison every aspect of our lives and destroy the world, our world. we're beginning to see a magnificent expression of global solidarity. An uprising of young people, very young people, insisting on action against climate catastrophe. Its leader, Greta Thunberg, spoke at the United Nations for us all. She said, entire ecosystems are collapsing, and all you can talk about is money. How dare you? Change is coming, whether you like it or not. The spirit of solidarity is strong in our world, just as in the France of my childhood that saved me and thousands of others. In the coming years, you and I and millions more will build an invincible chain of solidarity that will sweep away the racist threat and build a global future based on solidarity, justice, equality, and defense of our common home, this earth. Thank you very much.